You may have heard of
Mewing.
Mewing is a series of exercises and specific ways to hold yourself, your posture, that can influence the structure of your face and with that, your health and appearance.
Worldwide popularity for mewing has been absolutely skyrocketing on social media in the last 3 to 4 years. Part of this has to do with how easily accessible it is. It's something you can do right now from the comfort of your own home and the amazing results that it promises. Is this actually possible?
Who made a video about this topic already has a defined jawline. They found out about mewing last Tuesday and decided to pick up a camera and get some views and clicks.
Too good to be true, we caught up with Dr. Mike Mew to find out for ourselves.
The cornerstone of myofunctional therapy is eat with your lips closed.
Dr. Mike Mew is an unconventional orthodontist who believes in an environmentalist school of
But your
thought.
face is mobile, it's malleable. People don't want to believe that. They want to have the concept that their face is fixed. Because in many ways, your face is you.
That facial development and thus beauty are influenced by your environment and upbringing. He and his father pioneered the orthotropic idea that genetic control of the face's development is not precise and can be shepherded into an ideal form with postural and therapeutic exercises. Dr. Mew himself describes these practices of mewing, which is an eponym of his last name, as a sheepdog shepherding sheep with just the tongue, lips, and cheeks alone, whereas traditional orthodontics is a precise endeavor using facial appliances to get perfect straightness. The best known mewing exercises that most of you may have heard of is resting the tongue on the back of the hard palate of the mouth with the lips sealed, which, as he suggests, is the natural facial posture. There are plenty more exercises that you can follow and add to your routine for mewing, but before we get to that, let's review the scientific evidence first and see if this is actually something that may work. Dr. Mew suggests, in his own words, that there is no primary evidence for mewing, but there are plenty of secondary evidences. In simple terms, there is no direct scientific study conducted on the effectiveness of mewing, but perhaps because it is a slow process, there are plenty of theoretical evidences to suggest that everything adds up for it to work. Again, in theory. We know that many orofacial habits such as tongue thrust, thumb sucking, mouth breathing significantly affect a young child's facial development. So the question, naturally, that I asked Dr. Mew is, why is mewing so controversial or such a foreign concept when we've already established that there are things that can affect a child's face?
First of all, it undermines the science and business model of conventional orthodontics.
Mewing is a controversial idea because if it is proven to be true, it undermines many previously held fundamentals of orthodontics, such as whether misalignments should be treated by mewing exercises over time or by appliances much more quickly. What happens if an orthodontist recommends mewing but it makes the issue worse? Secondly, mewing implies that the facial development is, to a degree, controllable. That the way you look right now is because you didn't try hard enough in your youth or that you are somehow misguided in your orofacial habits. Whether it is proven to be true or not, it doesn't harm you guys to keep your lips sealed while you eat or to rest your tongue on the roof of your mouth. So there is more upside than downside to mewing, which is why it's so popular on social media. It's a DIY approach to a previously clinical
one of the
problem.
allegations from the British Orthodontic Society against me is suggesting young treatment, because their research all suggests it's much better to align the teeth when someone's older, or is more efficient not to bother with growth, because they find growth unpredictable. I guess if you don't understand the cause or the pathology, then you will find growth unpredictable. But
Right.
if you've got this unpredictable period, then it's much better to wait till someone's grown. And their research clearly does show that if you want to straighten teeth, you want to wait till someone's older. Yes, so much more predictable. It's so simple. It's so easy, and it will be more cost effective if that's your objective, to straighten teeth. However, I'm sticking my neck out trying to treat people at sort of 6, 7, 8. And yet, talking to Marissa, it's so obvious.
In the interview, Dr. Mew and I mentioned 3 main pieces of research that are significant proofs for mewing's effectiveness. Dr. Weston Price's studies, Dr. William Prophet's studies, and Dr. Eagle Harvold's studies. Each one looking at a completely different aspect of facial development, but all tying back to the environmentalist school of thought that facial development can be influenced by your behaviors and your environment. Dr. Weston Price went off into remote indigenous tribes and found that people consuming traditional unprocessed diets of tough fibrous materials had better teeth and tooth eruption than their modernized counterparts with their soft processed diets. He also noted how similar each face was to each other, implying that every face more or less reached their genetic potential for beauty, and there is less inequality in beauty between these groups. Our takeaway from this is that diet does have an impact on facial development, as the human face, much like every other muscle and bone, works on a very much use it or lose it basis. Much like how the body of a physical laborer man is more robust and adapted than that of a desk job man who is sedentary, the jawline of those with tougher diets is on average wider, stronger, and better defined. We call these traits of facial robustness. The jaw and thus the entire face have become more robust based on diet, which is a tick for environmentalist orthodontics. From the Weston Price Foundation, there are 20 dietary guidelines summarized from this book, and realistically, some of these are unavoidable, and others are scientifically questionable at best. I mean, after all, his work is from 100 years ago, but the recommendations that I would suggest you follow are: number 1, avoid soft processed foods and stick to single ingredient cooking, and number 2, avoid refined sugars and carbohydrates such as white flour and rice. Dr. William Prophet found that facial development is influenced by a number of forces. He utilized the framework of an equilibrium theory, not a new idea, but utilizing into orthodontics is quite revolutionary, that teeth move when their forces are not in balance. More interestingly, a low force for a long duration can move metaphorical mountains. The tongue resting on the roof of the mouth is a low force that's being applied over a long duration, and Dr. Prophet estimated that a minimum of 6 hours is needed daily of low applied pressure for some kind of tooth movement. Mind you, tooth movement and jaw movement, as Mewing promises, are slightly different, but the concept is still there. Very high forces over short durations do not have as much of an effect because the gum acts like a shock absorber, which is natural for jaw. Lastly, Dr. Egil Horvath performed some of the most thought-provoking experiments in the early 80s. By blocking the nasal airways of primates, he found that they adapted to mouth breathing, but that this also changed their jaw and muscle structure, arguably for the worse. Over time, all of the test monkeys with blocked noses diverged to a different facial appearance than the unblocked control group. Humans aren't monkeys, obviously, but we're not that different either. It is well documented that mouth breathing is a detriment to facial attractiveness. It even produces a characteristic looking face called the adenoid face, which is another tick for the environmentalist viewpoint, where the monkeys and the humans' mouth breathing behavior have both changed their skeletal and facial structures for the worse. The secondary research here points to mewing being a viable concept, that the small forces generated by the lips, cheeks, and tongue are enough to remodel bones and muscles. However, many clinicians and laypeople in general are still quite skeptical that the tongue can generate the needed forces. Dr. Mew counters this mechanicalistic idea by giving the example of a patient he saw in Brighton Hospital, where a cyst on her neck expanded through bone to a huge size simply by tiny but consistent pressures of osmolarity as the salt moved from cyst to bloodstream and vice versa.
Osmolarity, which is an interesting concept. It means that everything wants to be evenly distributed. Like when you let off a spark bomb, the smell then travels all the way through the room.
Yep.
So it wants to be evenly distributed. And of course, the salt can't pass through the potato, so it draws the water in. So there's a more even distribution of the salt from the top chamber to the bottom. Now, the same thing happens in a cyst here. So it draws in the water because you've got lots of particulates within the cyst. So the cyst gets bigger. Well, now that's a very, very small force, but it's there all of the time. So eventually you get this huge, great big development within the bone. Well, this is within the bone. Your tongue is sitting almost completely encapsulated by bone. Well, if it's there all the time.
But here's the million-dollar question. Should you be adding mewing to your daily routine? Dr. Mew mentions that for mewing to be most effective, patients need to be practicing below a certain age. In many cases, almost as young as 6. He also places a hard limit on mewing for 25 and beyond and suggests that orthotropics is not ideal. It's really only better than the alternatives.
It's a terrible option. And we're going, we need, what you want to be is prevention. Simple little ideas like shut your mouth when you're eating.
Yeah.
Stand up straight.
I mean, it's too late for this generation, maybe the next one.
Your lips closed. I mean, whoa, these are not complex. When we look at this myofunctional therapy, I genuinely believe that the cornerstone of myofunctional therapy is eat with your lips closed.
The main takeaway that Dr. Mew keeps on emphasizing is teaching young kids from the age of 5 and maybe even younger to keep their lips shut from when they eat, breathe, and sleep. This is because, as he explains, the face forms what's known as structural memory that eventually becomes a habit. As humans are creatures of comfort, no amount of training later on in life can build the same structural habits and postures as that of a young child who has been practicing proper orthotropic form. People who have been, say, mouth breathing since childhood have great difficulty in slipping out of these lifestyle habits because their face, quite literally their structure, have adapted to best serve their functional breathing patterns, as we saw in Horvath's experiments with the monkeys. The misconceptions around mewing are numerous. Many people from the internet fringes of the manosphere, a cultural identity dedicated to male self-improvement, use the unprovenness of mewing to promote their own products. It's like saying, see, mewing gets results. I was right about that when I suggested it to you and I showed all the haters. Now go buy my red light laser therapy for $4,000 because I was right about mewing, wasn't I? In doing so, the ideas and concepts of what mewing is have become deeply diluted as you hear about it from one bro scientist to another who themselves heard it from someone who has zero clue. It's like a game of whispers, the original meaning, message, and function get lost in the process. As Dr. Mew and I conclude our interview, mewing is only one piece of the puzzle, and it isn't a replacement for traditional orthodontics. It doesn't work effectively at all ages, and it isn't the cure to your facial development. These are postural practices that everyone should be using. Don't expect to get brownie points for brushing your teeth. You do it because the alternatives are much worse. The alternative to mewing with poor postural development results in a face that is unaesthetic. Functionally, there is no major downside to mewing. In some cases of teeth overjet, pushing against the palate can make the difference ever more noticeable. But for most people with neutral skeletal patterns, these are quite low resting forces for the entirety of your life. They are habits, not necessarily exercises, in which case it's not an unnatural thing to be doing. Resting your tongue on the roof of your mouth is not an unnatural behavior, and so the risks are comparatively low. Anecdotally, I once interviewed male model Carl Kugelman quite a long time ago, and during the conversation I asked him if he rests his tongue on the roof of his mouth naturally, which he and many other male and female models with well-defined faces indeed do. Don't take this as scientific evidence, this is purely an anecdotal bonus. Scroll down, check out the lecture notes, and continue doing your own research on whether this is something you want to add to your daily routine or not.